The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson.
So hello and welcome to our Chalke History Festival special series here on History Jackson, and we're joined by Simon Mayall. How are you doing, Simon?
Extremely well, Jackson, as usual. What a joy to be at the Chalke Valley History Festival.
It is a fantastic festival, isn't it?
Yeah. It's wonderful, it's wonderful. And the range, of obviously hardened old people like myself who've been studying history and loving it for years, and then all these youngsters learning the importance of history to understanding the modern world.
So your book looks at the Crusades from a different perspective, the clash between Christendom and
Caliphate.
Islam.
The Caliphate, rather than
Caliphate.
Religions, organising principles.
So why is it important for us to study that today, and why is it important for a younger audience to look at that?
Well, I think the modern world is very firmly shaped by that clash. I mean, that clash began literally almost from the death of Muhammad in 632. Very quickly, the armies of Byzantium and of the great Sasanian Persian Empire were both defeated in 636, only 4 years after he died. And if either of them had succeeded, Islam would probably have died. And yet within 100 years, all we understand of the Middle East is, to an extent, its contiguity with Islam, is largely carved out in that first 100 years. And it sets up in a time when religion was really important to people. It still is, but heaven, hell, God, the devil, damnation, salvation. And when you look at the map of the world today, it is the product of almost 1,300 years of confrontation. It's more complex than that. But the modern Middle East is, largely is actually the failure of the Caliphate, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And the lines on the map we look at now that dominate headlines really have to be understood in the context of a very, very long ideological, political, military, technological, economic struggle.
And you're mentioning the word caliphate there. I think a lot of listeners might be hearing that on the news, but not entirely sure what a caliphate is or what the caliphate is. Right. So could you just give us some detail on that, please?
Well, a caliph was basically the righteous successor to the prophet. So literally from the death of Muhammad in 632, somebody needed to be the leader and the inspiration for the small, at that stage, small band of Muslims. And in fact, at that stage, not only did you get a caliph, Abu Bakr at first, but you got the origins of the very, very modern, sort of contemporary split in the Islamic world between the Sunnis, the guardians of orthodoxy, and the Shia. It's a bizarre thing. It was all about who had the right to be a successor. But then, until the destruction of the Ottoman Empire in the 20th century, the Muslim world was basically organised around the idea of a caliphate, that there was a caliph who, to an extent, at his best, combined both the Christendom's idea of a pope and an emperor. So you had both a religious and a secular temporal leadership there. And it's very difficult to understand today now, when we're used to nation states and presidents and kings and emirs, the idea of a caliphate. But that was the organising principle. And the capital, of course, depending on power struggles, moved from Medina under the Arabs, it moved to Damascus under the Umayyads, it moved to Baghdad, it moved to Cairo. And then eventually, of course, it was taken by the Ottomans as they began to dominate the Islamic world. And there it stayed until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and when Ataturk formally abolished the Caliphate.
And it's so interesting to see such a long history with this as well, because I think we tend to compartmentalise history into certain eras, and you think about these conflicts within these particular periods. So when you're trying to look at such a long history from 600s to the 20th century, how are you able to look at that and show an overarching picture?
Well, the way I constructed the book, The House of War, slightly inevitably because I'm a military man, I took 10 great sieges and battles. The headline within that is Muslims versus Christians. And those are those big waypoints in history. The context, of course, is an awful lot of religious ideological division within the Islamic world. And that is based on ethnicity, Turks, Arabs, Iranians, definitely based on religion and heresy, Sunni, Shia, various other breakaway. And of course, then you look at Christendom, and you've got a battle between the emperor and the papacy. You've got a schism between Catholics and Orthodox. You've got an absolute schism between Catholics and then Protestants. You've got power struggles between the Valois and the Bourbons of France and the Habsburgs. You've got England snapping at everybody's heels in the 16th century, and yet through all that runs this sort of ideological, political, religious, between these two great blocks. They're not monolithic, but they are still a fact of life. But as I say, it is quite interesting when you see the bold statement, Muslims, Christians, to find how fractured. It wasn't everybody remotely. And the French had a big deal with the Ottomans for a long time to gang up on the Habsburgs. Suleiman the Magnificent is writing to Queen Elizabeth saying, you Protestants and we Muslims actually both hate the Catholics because they're bloody idolaters. The Habsburgs are writing to the Safavids, the Shia in Iran, saying, can we gang up on the Ottomans to take the pressure off us in Hungary? And all sorts of local deals been done. So it's fascinating, it's very human. And unsurprisingly, it's a hell of a mix, and some great stories. And so, if you like good stories, and I do, and I'm sure you do, Jackson, I'm sure many of your listeners and viewers love a good story. Well, that's what history is all about. Great stories. But let's get some facts. Let's get some context. Let's get some empathy.
No, and I really like how you're showing it's interconnected, because it's not just straightforward. It's Europe versus the Middle East. No. It's not, and the Caliphates and the Muslims do spread into part of Europe, and you talk about some of that as well.
Oh my goodness! I mean, you've got to look at the map. Just how far the forces of Islam got. I mean, they were outside the gates of Vienna twice. Last time in 1683, and in fact, the siege of Vienna in 1683 is the inspiration for Tolkien's battle for the Middle Earth, Minas Tirith. Mordor are the forces of the Ottomans, Gondor are the Habsburgs, and Sobieski's fantastic winged hussars from Poland are the riders of Rohan. And of course, at that time, not only are we contesting in the Mediterranean and Central Europe, we're contesting in the Red Sea, because the voyages of discovery by Columbus and Vasco da Gama are also, and they all sail off with a great sort of Templar flag on them, on their sails. They're sailing off to try and outflank the Ottoman Empire and outflank the wealth of the Ottoman Empire in order to conduct war against the Ottoman Empire. So, grubby trade along with, religiously inspired issues, really overlap. Multiple motivations in some ways.
I think that's the best bit about history, is when you strip away that traditional narrative that we put across it. It is so much more fun.
It is, and the people at the heart of it. We're inclined to take an individual and they normally appear in history because they're a great general, or they're now a king, or they're a caliph, or an emir at a particular battle. And then the great cry I've always found is, what's their backstory? Why are they there? How did they get there? Sometimes it's obvious because they were born into it. I love the story of John de la Valette, who is at the siege of Rhodes in 1565. He commands it. He was at the siege of Rhodes in 1522 as a young man. In the middle, he's taken as a slave and as a galley slave for the Ottomans. So by the time he's fighting on, Burgoo, not St Elmo, he's 70 years old. He has seen it all. And of course he's up against Dragut Reis, who again is 80 by this stage, who's also been a galley slave under the Christians. Mustafa Pasha was again at the siege of Rhodes. He was opposite John de la Valette 40 odd years earlier, and he's failed, sent off to Syria. He's 70. These backstories about what motivates them. Sometimes they're old men. You go to Don John of Austria. He's 24. He's there because Philip of Spain, his half brother, says, "Well, I'm not giving my fleet to you, Holy League, under Pius V, unless the commander is a Spaniard." And of course, he's got to be a Spaniard of a certain rank. here's my half-brother. And what happens to Don John? We all remember him because Chesterton's, Don John of Austria is going to the war. 31 years old, he dies of fever in the Netherlands. They can't get his body back to Spain because the English are dominating the English. So they chop him into 4 pieces, put him in salt, put him in a saddlebag, ride him across Europe, stitch him back together again, and bury him in the Esquirol. But these are the things. Where do they come from? What happens to them after their moment in history?
That's not an ending I would like.
No. I want to die old, 90, 95 in my bed.
Particularly not in a satchel going across.
No. 4 satchels.
So have you got a favourite character that you came across when working on this book?
I like Saladin. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Walter Scott sort of raised him up to be almost, by accident. He should have been a sort of feudal knight. He should have been a paladin. He should have been a chum of Richard III's, frankly. And of course, he is a bit, because when Richard falls off his horse, Saladin sends him another horse. When Richard gets ill, Saladin sends him sherbets from Mount Hebron and peaches. Richard even tries to marry his sister to Saladin's brother. I mean, he's a great character. John de la Valette is a great guy. Don John of Austria, as they advance towards the Ottoman fleet, he summons his musicians. He's in full armour, lesser helmet, and he dances the Gaillard, which is a sort of, if anybody's watched the film Elizabeth, is like a volta, on the foredeck of the Real with 2 other Spanish gentlemen. What I think the Italians call spezzatura, sorry, studied nonchalance. Mehmet II is quite an interesting character. Giuseppe Giustiniano Longo, who commands the Genoese mercenaries at the very poignant siege and fall of Constantinople. They're all interesting people. The motivation, leadership's always interests me as a soldier, of course, and how some leaders succeed and some fail, and some rise to the occasion, and some are lucky, and some are, just doomed by fate to fail. But maybe fail dramatically.
Particularly some of them that you just mentioned as well. That's absolutely brilliant. Now, we've only spoken about a short number of people within this book in this festival special. Where can people go and grab a copy of your book?
Well, I hate to say it, Amazon, of course, Waterstones. It's a pair of books. I wrote a book called Soldier in the Sand, which was rather more autobiographical, which took my family story and the history of the Middle East from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So History of War is really a prequel, although some of it is in the introduction. So I think for those, and I genuinely say this, it's very readable, it's very accessible, it has a slight military bias, probably inevitably, but that makes it quite exciting. And I think it's such an important part of the world, because look at what's going on with Israel at the moment, Lebanon, all the area which was the product of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It's quite interesting to be able to look at what's going on in Iran. Look at what's Erdogan doing, with accused of neo-Ottomanism. And I think all the leaders of these various parts of what we call the wider Middle East carry on their shoulders the memories, in some ways, the obligations, the discipline, the resonances of history of this long history of both internal conflict, Sunni Shia, Turk Arab, Iranian, and the external conflict with the infidel, and very often, of course, the jihadi websites and the like, and Osama bin Laden's always talking about crusaders and Zionists, and the armies of Richard and Louis and Barbarossa are back in the lands, and George Bush uses the word crusade in a sort of rather modern thing, a sort of noble activity, and of course leapt on by many people in the Middle East. Crusade, once again, Christian armies trying to overthrow Muslims, attacking Sunnism, etc. So I think if you need empathy and you want to have respect for other people's cultures, then knowing history, I think, and religion is good. And I would simply recommend this as a very good book, inevitably, to access it in what I would say I like to think a readable way that will sweep a reader along.
Yeah, of course, and contextualising what's going on now is also important. So
absolutely.
We can understand. Well, thank you very much for coming on.
A huge pleasure. Thank you very much, Jackson.
the Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson.